Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who have experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This week, we are talking about Sexual Assault Awareness Month and the Start by Believing campaign. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education Coordinator at the Victim Service Center. With me today, I have Alison Jones-Lockwood. Alison uses she, her pronouns and is nationally recognized for her expertise in designing community-specific collaborative protocols to address sexual violence. With over 20 years experience managing and assisting victim advocacy programs, Ms. Jones-Lockwood has trained extensively on the criminal justice response to sexual assaults, including the impact of sexual assaults in the aftermath. She has trained countless advocates, law enforcement personnel, and healthcare professionals in local, regional, statewide, and national trainings. Ms. Jones-Lockwood began her career working with survivors and advocates within the U.S. Navy and has worked for rape crisis centers in California, Kansas, and Missouri. So, Alison, thank you so much for being here today. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I also have returning Louis Damiani. So Louis uses he, him pronouns and is the executive director of the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, which is, I hope many people know by now, is a nonprofit organization that provides 24/7 individualized services and resources to victims of sexual assault, violent crime, and other traumatic circumstances. His professional career in business and public service spans more than 30 years. He has served the Central Florida community as a county commissioner, corporate executive, small business owner, governmental manager, television host, and homeowners association president. So throughout his career, Louis has served his various roles with character, honesty, and passion, earning him a solid reputation of integrity among his peers. In 2020, Louis was honored with the prestigious Don Quixote Hispanic Community Champion Award by the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and Prospera for his continuous efforts to support the Central Florida Hispanic community. He has a master's degree in public administration from the University of Central Florida, and he did his undergraduate studies at the Ohio State University. So Louis, thank you so much for being here today as well.
It was a pleasure to see you.
As a really brief introduction, the first episode of this podcast was actually titled Start by Believing, and it actually featured one of our Speakers Bureau members, Sharon, and VSC victim advocate at the time. So now he's one of our contract licensed therapists, Johnny Kramer, where we touched on the impacts of not being believed when survivors share their story and ways we can be better supporters. So that episode actually started off Sexual Assault Awareness Month, or SAM, which occurs every April for 2020, just as the pandemic began, in an effort to continue engaging the community and spreading awareness about sexual violence, even when we couldn't do so in person. So for this year, we wanted to start off, Sam, by talking about the Start by Believing campaign itself, its history, how it can be used as a prevention tool, other events happening during Sexual Assault Awareness Month and ways people can get involved and honor and support survivors. And today we are really lucky to be joined by our VSC Executive Director, Damiani, as well as Alison Jones-Lockwood, who both come with extensive experience advocating for survivors in sexual assault prevention. So with that, Alison, I was wondering if you could just start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Sure. So I began my career in the early 2000s, actually with the United States Navy. And I was doing sexual assault, air quotes, prevention at the time, which was really just risk reduction, but we called it prevention because that's really all we knew at the time. But I also oversaw the sexual assault advocacy program. And back in those days, I would go on to ships and give presentations. I got to go to sea for a week from San Diego to Hawaii and give 15 to 20 minute sexual assault kind of 101 training to sailors as they were preparing for deployment. And I eventually transitioned to a rape crisis center in San Diego where I was the volunteer coordinator. And then I moved back to the Midwest and worked for an organization there called the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault, and had a variety of roles. The last role that I had there was Director of Advocacy, where I oversaw all of the sexual assault services for the organization. I've been with End Violence Against Women International for a little bit over 10 years. And as with any nonprofit, I wear a number of different hats. I oversee the Start by Believing campaign. I oversee our social media efforts. I also am engaged in our online training institute modules, training bulletins, anything else that they throw my way. So a variety of different roles over the years.
Thank you so much, Alison. Really appreciate you sharing that. I'm really glad that there was something going on, because I know that military sexual assault is very important to talk about. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between risk reduction and prevention later on, because I'd like to kind of hear a little bit more about that. But thank you so much for all that you do and all that you continue to do on behalf of sexual violence prevention. I just wanted to hear from you, Louie, for those that may be tuning in for the first time. Could you share a little bit about the VSC and what you do?
Yeah. So the VSC, or the Victim Service Center of Central Florida, our mission here is providing individualized services and resources to victims of violent crime, sexual assault, and any other kind of traumatic event. And we're now in our 23rd year serving the Central Florida community. We're in three counties, Orange being the largest. Well, I should say we have offices in 3 counties. So Orange, Osceola, and Seminole counties. So really the entire Central Florida region. And we've grown it over the last 23 years from a little, 2-3 people, I think, and we maybe served 300 people our first year. And, this past year, we served over 6,000 clients. We do everything from the initial immediate crisis intervention work. We run a 24/7 helpline staffed by mostly master's level counselors and social workers. But we also do victim advocacy, victim support. We have a very robust therapeutic program. And of course, the work that you do, our prevention and outreach work is truly extraordinary. By the way, congratulations on reaching 100 podcasts and now to your new television program as well. So we're really casting a broad net and really impacting a lot of people across Central Florida, across the state, and now with your podcast across the world. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you, especially with your extensive, expertise in these areas. So I think that it would be really helpful to just start off on what exactly is the Start by Believing campaign?
I love getting the chance to talk about Start by Believing. So the origins from Start by Believing started many, many years before we officially launched the campaign. We launched the campaign in April 2011 at our international conference in Chicago. So last year was the 10-year anniversary. So this year's 11 years of Start by Believing, but it actually started in the 1980s. Our CEO, Joanne Archambault, was a detective in the child abuse unit when she first saw the need for Start by Believing. And of course, she didn't have a name for it then, but it started because children were disclosing sexual abuse and they were not being believed. Their mothers, their fathers, their siblings, and some of the detectives investigating these cases were not believing these children. And then she became sergeant over the sex crimes unit in San Diego, and the problem became even more profound. It was even more common that the survivor support system and the detectives, again, investigating their cases, did not believe them. So the campaign had been a dream of Joanne's for many years before we launched the campaign. And now 11 years later, it's international. There are over 650 local Start by Believing campaigns, and thousands of people have made the pledge.
That's incredible. While you were talking, I was like, oh my gosh, 2011, that was when I graduated high school. And I was from Chicago, so that's wild. But yeah, it makes sense that it's been a need that's been here for a long time. And, going off of that, why is this campaign needed? So you mentioned that people weren't believing survivors. Is there like a particular goal for Start by Believing as far as, encouraging survivors to come forward and share their story?
That's an excellent question. And I'm going to start with a story. I met with a survivor this morning, and she was sharing her story with me. She's interested in being a part of our Survivor Voices project. And she had, the story that you would think everybody would believe. It literally was a stranger who jumped out of the bushes and sexually assaulted her and a soccer player teammate. And somebody heard something in the creek bed where he had dragged them to. That person called 911. Police responded. They thought that they were responding to a suspicious vehicle. And when police rolled up on scene, the survivor that I spoke with went running to the car. And, long story short, they did an investigation. They were able to identify the perpetrator within a couple of days. He was arrested. He is serving 2 consecutive life sentences in Texas. And the survivor started doing presentations for the police academies. And one of the first trainings that she did was with the initial responding officer. And he shared with her that when he initially rolled up and saw her running to him, he didn't believe her. And he didn't believe her because she knew the guy's height, she knew his weight, she knew very detailed information about the perpetrator. And from his perspective, he would have expected her to be like her teammate, who was disorganized, definitely rooted in trauma, did not remember anything. Her statement was half a page, whereas the survivor I spoke with wrote 4 pages of details down. So he told her he didn't believe her until he watched his squad car video. And his squad car video showed her struggling to get away from the perpetrator as, he rolled up on the scene. And so we have scenarios like these where it's clearly a stranger sexual assault, which are often somewhat, again, air quotes, more believable than the typical non-stranger sexual assault. But it shows that we still really need to drive home this message that survivors need to be believed. So I think I'm getting to the root of your original question, but, so many survivors over the course of my career have told me, or I have directly witnessed them not being believed when they've told law enforcement, when they've told their friends and their family members. And we know that survivors on average tell 2 to 3 people before they ever make a report to law enforcement. So Start by Believing is just as critical for our community as it is for our criminal justice professionals, because we need those 2 to 3 people to be equipped to handle those disclosures so that if the survivor does want to report, they're set up at least in a supportive environment to do that from the beginning.
That's such a good point. And I really appreciate you sharing that particular story. There's a lot of things that kind of came to mind while you were sharing. just understanding more of how trauma can affect the brain is so important for people to understand. Not everyone's going to have a video from a squad car to back up, right, what they shared. And then also, you're right, there's this kind of script that we have of what sexual violence typically looks like. And even then, we may have a hard time believing survivors. But 8 out of 10 times it's someone that they know. So yeah, so much work that Start by Believing has done and is continuing to do. And also, I've never heard that statistic before, that on average, they tell 2 to 3 individuals in their lives before they report. I think that's really important to highlight. Louis, I wanted to ask you, is it common for the survivors that we work with to not share their story? And why do you think that is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a myriad. The answer for sure is it's not uncommon. It's actually, we know just from the data of our own clients that they don't. I can tell you that if we don't make contact with somebody, like in the immediate aftermath, calling our crisis line, or having us respond immediately upon the sexual assault. But let's say that doesn't occur. For all the other clients that we see, which is the vast majority, it's over 5,000 other clients that we see, and those individuals on average don't even come to get our services until about it's a little over 9 years after their victimization. So, some of it's fear, some of it's shame, guilt. I mean, different people have a different story. It's all over the board, but so many times people will tell you that it's because they were afraid nobody would believe them. And so, really to underscore the importance of the Start by Believing movement. And I didn't know the history. So I was so glad Alison shared the history. You probably don't even know this, Emilie, but a few years before you were here, it wasn't all that long ago, we did a rally on the steps of the courthouse with the state attorney, a Start by Believing Day. And it was pretty cool. Yeah, when State Attorney Ayala was here, and she asked me one day, like, what we should do. I said, well, it's the beginning of Sexual Assault Awareness Month. There's this campaign that I know about, and we should do it, just draw attention to it, and blah, blah, blah. And it was crazy. We had a whole bunch of people show up, took the pledge, really sort of just underscored what Alison was saying. It's not just police, although it is law enforcement that we want to get through to, but it's everybody else. If your predisposition is from the perspective of victim blaming, of, well, what did you do to deserve it? Or it was the first word out of your mouth is, well, were you drinking? These kinds of things are so can be so devastating to someone, and can then just ingrain that culture of disbelief that then causes our clients to not come see us for 9 years. And then by the time 9 years is in, we might be able to help them get back to their best life. But so many have turned to drugs or turned to alcohol in the meantime, or, their life took a different trajectory because they weren't able to come forward, or didn't feel the strength to be able to come forward for all those reasons, and the disbelief, and the fear of disbelief. So so it's definitely not made up. It's definitely a real phenomenon that we see, and our data doesn't lie. And that data goes back as far as 2014. About every 3 years, we end up having the University of Central Florida call back over our data to really understand it. And, in my mind, the last time they did, I was like, oh man, we're moving the bar so much. We do all this prevention education, and we do all this Start by Believing, and we actually it was 3 months longer than the preceding time we had done it. So I was like, so disappointed. We want that window to close. We want people to understand that the sooner that they can get to an organization like ours and begin to get help and get on a healing path, the better off it is for them and for everyone. Because I suspect to what Alison said about telling 3 people about your sexual assault, you've over time, you've shared that story with a lot of people. And wouldn't the narrative be better if they were like the first person they told said, holy cow, we need to get you to the local rape crisis center, and these guys are amazing and they can get you help, and they got me help. And just knowing that when you come through the door, that there's not going to be any sense of judgment here, that our people are going to open it and embrace you and try to help you get back to, the best life that you can have moving forward.
Definitely, Louis. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Alison, I know that you worked at a few different rape crisis centers. Did you see something similar with survivors kind of coming through where there was this delay in when they shared their stories or seek out services? I'm not sure if you did any similar kind of research, but I'm just curious.
We definitely didn't do that level of research, which I think is fantastic to know that from your client base. I find that really, really interesting. And I think programs should be doing that because it's really interesting. So we didn't do anything formal, but we did know just anecdotally that most survivors, particularly calling the crisis line, were delayed. Some of them were, of course, acute because they needed help right then. But many of the survivors coming in for counseling, crisis intervention sessions, it had happened many years before. I was most deeply engaged in the, kind of the immediate response with hospital advocacy, law enforcement advocacy. And so we didn't see years delay, but we definitely saw days delay in most of the survivors.
That makes a lot of sense. And of course, acute being within 120 hours, that's when that person is able to get DNA evidence collected. But I also wanted to ask you, Alison, as far as, the Start by Believing being a campaign, there's also a Start by Believing Day. So when is that? And what are some activities or things that go on that day?
So Start by Believing Day is the first Wednesday of April. This year, we are celebrating the 7th annual Start by Believing Day. And another little aspect of history, the Start by Believing Day actually started out of the state of Utah. Representative Angela Ramiro sponsored a resolution in 2015 to create the first Start by Believing Day in Utah. That was going to be the first Wednesday, take place every year. And we reached out to her and said, hey, we would love to take this across the United States. We'd love to take it global. With her full support, we did that in 2016. So it's now a yearly day that we recognize Start by Believing. And the great thing about the campaign is that it's very community driven. So each individual community plans and launches their own initiatives every year. We kind of view our role as a support or resource to local communities. So we have created a bunch of materials, whether it's infographics or diversity posters. We have a social media toolkit, just a number of different resources and materials that communities can use for free. Many communities do focus on Start by Believing Day, but I always like to mention that Start by Believing is more than a one day a year thing. It is a year-round campaign even, but it's also a day-to-day philosophy that we need to integrate into our response to all survivors at all times.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that because we have these awareness days and they're great, but it's let's keep the conversation going all the time. It's really important. But I know you, Louis, were mentioning, obviously VSC will Start by Believing when a survivor walks through our doors, but I also wanted to check with you. And I also want to mention as well, I want to take some time, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender identity, all that stuff. Of course, there's this idea you were kind of mentioning that this is what sexual violence typically looks like. So it's typically like a woman on her evening jog and a man jumps out of the bushes and sexually assaults her. That happens, not always the case, right? But it's also important to highlight that no matter your identity, where you come from, you will be believed at the VSC, at places like where Alison works and stuff like that. So just want to highlight that too. But with that, how do we engage? Because you mentioned, Alison, talking about, working with first responders, such as law enforcement, nurses, things like that. But Lou, I wanted to ask you, how do we encourage our partners in the community, including healthcare providers, other agencies, as well as community members in general, to kind of start by believing?
Well, I mean, it's a multi-pronged approach. We're fortunate here in Central Florida because we participate in and we lead what are called SARTs, and that acronym stands for Sexual Assault Response Teams. And so we pull everybody together into a room on at least a quarterly basis that are everyone that might be involved in a response to sexual violence. So we invite all of our law enforcement partners. We invite hospital, ER administrators and professionals. We invite the state attorney's office, the Department of Law Enforcement, anyone that might potentially kind of touch a victim, because, they're the ones dealing with them day in and day out. And we have a protocol. We all sat around way back when, and we all said, okay, this is your role, this is your role, this is your role. And so everybody understands their interconnectivity and their role, from if somebody ends up in a hospital emergency room, where the individual goes next, and that they can refer back to us. So there's this whole integrated referral system. But then we also take those opportunities to always bring, always talk about starting by believing. To do, and I don't even know what the acronym is. I'm sure Alison's way more versed than me, but we do these kinds of trainings called FETI, F-E-T-I, and it's forensic. I don't know what. Alison, please jump in if you know. But it effectively talks about, it looks at the how you interview people, the approach that you take, the belief system that you have going in, just the way that you handle a victim to minimize and mitigate the trauma that they're already experiencing. So we work, we introduce those kinds of topics, and it's really cool to have everybody together on an ongoing basis, continually having that dialogue. What you see over time is that when you get folks that are resistant, because I don't know, maybe old school is the right word. I don't know, but there are some people that enter into these forums and you can just tell from their belief system that they're like, I don't subscribe to all that. Like, I've been doing this for 100 years and they're always guilty until proven innocent, and it's like crazy town. But they stick out like a sore thumb. And what you see is that they'll gradually over time begin to get it, and they'll gradually start to fall into the fold of, like the rest of us, where we are very victim centered and always are talking from the start by believing mentality, and then let's back, then we can always back into it, like if we find something's crazy. If I can tell you from my experience that never happens. Nobody that comes to me, that comes to us, it has contrived something, by the time that they've found the strength and the wherewithal to seek our services, I can unequivocally tell you that something happened to them. At least in my experience, and I've been at this work now for a decade here, and I helped start this place 20 years ago. But I don't have a single example of that not being the case. So, over time, but to your question, we're very fortunate here that's the system and the approach that we use of getting all the parties together and talking and working collaboratively, focused on that goal.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Louie, for highlighting that. And yeah, that is a question that comes up sometimes when I do prevention education, of this idea of like, this myth that survivors are more likely to do false reports. And it's the same percentage as for other felonies, I always like to mention. So you're just as likely to be falsely accused of sexual assault as you are for murder. But there's this, like, because of the rape culture that we live in, there's this like heightened belief of it. But Alison, I wanted to ask from you, what is the other acronym, if you know it, but also I wanted to ask you too, I believe that the Start by Believing campaign, those handouts that you were mentioning, they have specific ones for like law enforcement and for like as a healthcare provider, right? If you want to talk a little bit about that too.
Sure. So FETI is the Forensic Experiential Trauma Interview.
Thank you.
And then the handouts that we have. So I think you're talking about the infographics that we have for social media. They are, well, now we have, I believe, just under 30 different graphics that are available for communities. So some of them have some little tidbits of information that, like that 2 to 3 statistic that I shared earlier, that survivors are more likely to tell 2 to 3 people before they report. But some of them are from the perspective of law enforcement, from a healthcare professional. So the healthcare, for one example, I can't remember the exact words, but it's something like, if a patient presents in the emergency department with a stomach ache, I start from the presumption that this person has a stomach ache. If a person presents and says they've been sexually assaulted, I start from that same presumption. So it's just making that connection that they start by believing what that person tells them.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think I read the law enforcement one too, where it's like you just understanding like your role in this, like Louie was saying too. So I think it's so amazing that the Start by Believing campaign not only is individualized for communities, but also for community members and first responders to know kind of where their role is. And I know that also when we were planning this podcast, you were mentioning and you emphasize how Start by Believing not only helps with this awareness and breaking the silence, right, on this topic, but can also specifically be used as a prevention tool. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Start by Believing should be seen as one aspect of prevention. Of course, if you think of prevention as, sort of the umbrella, there are a lot of different aspects of how we can prevent sexual assault. And I think Start by Believing is one of the tools that we can use. And I'm going to frame it in 2 different ways. The first, most obvious one is if we start by believing, it's possible we could prevent future sexual assaults. And I'm going to give you another story. So a survivor that I've worked with, her name is Taylor. Taylor was sexually assaulted in 2016 when at least 2 men broke into her apartment and sexually assaulted her while she was laying in bed with her 2-year-old daughter. She immediately reported the sexual assault. She had to report it a little bit differently than we would typically think. They had moved her phone from where it typically was. So in the aftermath, she could not locate her phone, but she could find her computer. So she posted on Facebook asking if anybody was awake at that time. It was, 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and said she needed somebody to call 911 for her. She had just been sexually assaulted. When the responding officers got to her house, their first comment was, "So what happened here?" As if she had been a party to what had taken place. They asked her right away if she had been on Tinder or OkCupid. And she could tell from the very beginning that they did not take her seriously as she's cradling her 2-year-old daughter. She had a forensic exam. She had a detailed victim interview about 36 hours after the assault took place. She had not slept. She was again asked the same questions, whether she had been on dating apps. She provided a lot of information. So she was similar to that first story that I shared, where while the assault was taking place, in her mind, she was thinking about all of the ways she could preserve evidence. She provided a lot of names and information. to the investigating officer. She did everything she could to fully participate. They went to her apartment complex at 2:00 on a Wednesday afternoon, only found 2 residents home, never went back to ask other residents if they had heard anything. They did not look into any of the names that she provided them. They did not look into any of the workers who had been coming in and out of her building. And 6 months later, they closed the case. Shortly after that, a sheriff's deputy in the county next door basically was abducted from the sheriff's parking lot, and she was kidnapped and she was sexually assaulted for 2 hours. They dropped her in the middle of nowhere. She went to the other sheriff's department and made a report. A metropolitan-wide manhunt took place, and they were able to locate the suspects within 2 days, and the DNA matched Taylor's case. So this is that obvious example where if Taylor's case had been investigated thoroughly, they might have identified that one of the perpetrators lived in the same building as she did. We could have, in theory, prevented that deputy from ever being abducted and assaulted. So we can think about prevention in that aspect, because we know that many perpetrators are serial perpetrators. They've done it before, they will do it again. And when survivors are not believed, when they're reported, when their cases are not taken seriously, that effectively allows that perpetrator to continue to sexually assault other people. So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect that I always like to mention is when survivors are believed, when they are supported, they have better health and healing outcomes. When they are not believed and supported, they tend to have poor health and healing outcomes. So if we think about this from a healthcare aspect, when we believe and support survivors, we can prevent long-term health consequences like autoimmune disease and cardiovascular disease and gastrointestinal diseases and migraine and pelvic pain and endometriosis and all of these other conditions that we typically see with victims of trauma. We could prevent some of those from taking place.
That is such a good point. And that's why we see how community members coming together, like departments of health and other healthcare providers and law enforcement and all this stuff, this kind of communal coming together of supporting survivors, because they all have a role to play. And I also appreciate that aspect of prevention too. I hadn't thought of it in that regard, of preventing health as well, like bad health outcomes, I should say, the way that you worded it so perfectly. That is so important.
I'm curious before you move on, because that is fascinating to me. And I think I probably, we know that the earlier the intervention with us, that, sort of the better the outcome, but I don't really have any empirical information. Is there some literature that we might turn to, Alison, that you're aware of? Because I find that fascinating. I'd love to work that into our narrative and really, talk about, highlight that point, because that is so important. It makes sense.
Yeah. So I have a presentation that I've given specifically on Start by Believing as a tool for prevention. The entire presentation is available on the Start by Believing resources page. You can view it in its entirety. And so I go over the data in that presentation pretty thoroughly, but I can also send you some of the individual data points.
Awesome. That's great. I'd love to work that into our prevention narrative. And Emilie's the one that runs that for us. This is great. Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely, I'm thinking, I don't know where it started necessarily, but those health consequences have really been on my mind for the last few months. I was listening to a podcast called Bar Fights. It's with Sarah Klein. She's the first known survivor of Larry Nassar. And she was sharing some of her health consequences, as was the survivor that she was interviewing. And it just kind of reinforced and solidified what I already knew was going on. And I've reached out to a couple of other survivors and talked with them about some of the health consequences they've experienced. And, I've always known there is a big connection between autoimmune disease and trauma. And so just seeing those kind of coming together, I think we're going to hear more and more about it as we continue.
Well, I
this
think
work.
it's very timely for us. We just got a grant from, it comes, I believe, through OVW that we picked up at earlier last spring, actually. And the intent of the federal dollars was to get local rape crisis centers to work more collaboratively with their health departments. And we got the grant, and it was we were able to foster a partnership with one county to the south of us. They loved it, but I think this information could be very valuable, in our partnership. We now are running videos within the Department of Health that we produced cooperatively, talking about, survivors and services and so forth. But the health, I'm sure to them, the health outcome information will really help them, because they have their own, what do they call those regional healthcare plans that each DOH, the CHIPS and the SHIPS, the community improvement, community health.
Community Health Improvement Plan?
Probably. I'm not an acronym guy, but I know that's you're probably right. So it's really cool, right? Because we sit at the table with them as they're making those determinations about community health and what the focus is going to be. So very fascinating.
That pain may be rooted in trauma, but it doesn't make it any less real. And it doesn't mean we don't treat the pain. Maybe we also treat the trauma, but it doesn't absolve practitioners from treating the pain that goes with it. So that's probably why this stuff has been in my mind so much, because I just keep hearing that over and over and over again. But I'm so glad to hear you're working with the health department, because they need start by believing too.
Yeah. No, they've been very open. I was very surprised, actually, at how open and appreciative. At first, I thought it was crazy, because I'm like, why is the federal government sending money to the local rape crisis centers to get us to try to work more collaboratively when those very health centers are funded by federal dollars, right? So wouldn't it just be easier to tell the people that you gave your money to already, like, start working with the local rape crisis center? But anyway, it worked. The message is getting through, and we are forming these partnerships at the local level. So it's, I think, a win. Who wins in the end is the community, and having these kind of partnerships works because they're mutually beneficial, and then they become a good referral source and an ambassador for us, and vice versa. So it's really awesome. I'm really so glad that you brought this up. I always learn something on these podcasts.
I'm glad that I'm able to host this space for you then. And I just want to reiterate like what you said too, Alison, about that idea of how awful it is that, being basically re-victimized by these people who are meant to help individuals, and saying like, oh, well, it's all in your head, when we're seeing now like research and things like that, there are real health effects. And of course, not even bringing into the concept of the ACEs study, right? So adverse childhood experiences and surveys and things like that. So really glad and fortunate that we're working with healthcare providers and the Department of Health. And I also wanted to hear from you. I know that shifting gears here just a little bit, you were sharing some stories of survivors and things like that, but wanted to give you a chance to talk about the Survivor Voices Project as well.
So the Survivor Voices Project is, I guess, kind of a journey that I've been on the last about 18 months. It started as a desire to host a virtual event because of COVID. We wanted to connect with our community, and we wanted to host a survivor panel. But we wanted to host a panel that was, number one, reflective of the realities of sexual assault. So we wanted to have a diverse survivor panel with different experiences. So we reached out to a lot of our contacts and just said, hey, we're interested in talking with survivors. If you know of survivors that would be interested in talking with us, we would love to connect with them. So that's what I started with. 18 months later, I have met with 45 survivors, and we have gone well beyond that initial survivor panel that we hosted in, 1 year ago tomorrow. So it's been a year since that event, but the project, as I was meeting with survivors, I saw a real need and an interest to share their stories. And with everything kind of shutting down, a lot of the typical formats that survivors would do, they connect with their Rape Crisis Center and they would share their story at community education events or professional trainings. A lot of that wasn't happening. And I really started to think of how can we give survivors a platform to share their story in the way that they want to share it. So we did a few different things, and 18 months later, the project still continues to grow and change. But the first thing we did was in April of last year, for the 10th anniversary of Start by Believing, we shared either videos or graphics on social media that the survivors had created or that we had helped them create, sharing their story. And then we re-released our victim interviewing training module last summer. And when we reframed it, it's all about helping victims retrieve memory. And we weaved 6 different survivor stories throughout that module. And then we wanted a way to recognize and honor survivors. So we created a Survivor Voices webpage that's dedicated to survivors. And survivors got to choose whether or not they wanted to participate in I should say, back up and say, every single thing that we have done is 100% with survivor permission. And it's not blanket permission. They give us permission every single time we do something. So every time I share their story in a presentation, I ask permission. And it's I think that's one of the most important aspects of the project, because I've heard time and time again, survivors will say, well, so-and-so shared my story for fundraising without my permission. And I really think it's important that we always go back to the survivor and ask permission. And I've only had a survivor one time tell me, now's not a good time. 100% okay. So we created this website, and it has a beautiful picture of the survivor. It has a quote, and then you can click on it and go to their individual page. And that page is whatever they wanted to say about being a survivor, about being believed, about not being believed. And so it's really just, it's their space. And we've also done a few other things. I've been hosting monthly live interviews with survivors on Instagram. So that's another way that they've been able to share their story. And then just this week, we got a request from a SANE in Arizona who's hosting free SANE trainings and wants to incorporate survivor stories, and reached out and said, would some of the survivors you've worked with be interested? And I sent an email out, and 18 of them said, yes, please. They want to speak and they want to share their story. And so now we've just kind of tried to create a vessel to allow them to do that. So
that's amazing. We have a speakers bureau ourselves here at VSC, and I have the fortunate privilege to work with survivors that come with me on my different trainings and share their stories. And they, I too also ask, like, if it's ever too much, like, let me know. And I've had survivors like, hey, it's a little heavy this week, and that's very normal. But I do know that I've heard a lot of how much it means to them to be able to have that space on their terms. So really appreciate you having that space for them, even virtually too. And I'll get a link hopefully, and then I can put that in the description. And I just want to take this time to kind of reflect of how far we've come, really, because it wasn't very long ago where no one was really kind of having these spaces for survivors. So Louie and Alison, you have both been involved in this work for many, many years. And first of all, again, thank you so much for everything that you do and continue to do for survivors and victims. So throughout your careers, how have you seen the culture kind of shift surrounding sexual violence? Are people talking about it more? Do you think this campaign has been successful? Just kind of reflections about where we've come.
So much has changed. I think back to 2000 when I started doing this work, and I was a college student and I was getting involved with the Women's Center on campus, and I went to those first risk reduction presentations and the content that was being shared, and such small groups and small conversations. And then, when I was with the military, it was huge groups and small bits of information. And now back then our reach was the people that were literally in front of our face. I could give a presentation with however many people were in that room, and maybe they had some conversations, but it really was limited to the people that were sitting in front of me. And now we can use social media, which opens us up to millions of people. So every Start by Believing Day, I track hashtag Start by Believing on Twitter and see how far the reach is. And generally we're over 6 million impressions on Twitter, which is tremendous. I could never do that solo as an awareness educator. But social media gives us this incredible tool to spread our message. And it's also, the thing is, my tweet as Start by Believing campaign can only go so far. But when everybody uses that hashtag across the country, and those 650 communities, and they're all simultaneously promoting Start by Believing on the same day, our reach is huge. So I think that's definitely a change. But I also know that over the last 5-6 years, people are talking about it more. They're talking about it on social media, but they're sharing their stories. And, that is the one thing that Me Too has given us that I would say is a benefit, is it has given more people the courage to share their story publicly. It hasn't always been great, and it hasn't always been pretty, and there definitely have been some unintended consequences, but there has been some good that comes with it, just purely from an awareness standpoint. I know that because the people that are close to me, they know what I do for a living. And so they come to me as a resource and they ask me questions, and they're coming to me because they saw something in the news or because they saw something on social media, and then they're coming to me to touch base about it. But the fact that they saw it outside of me in the first place is an improvement, because 22 years ago, it was just me talking about it.
So true. Yeah. And while you were talking, I was reflecting on my experience. That's where I started this work as an undergrad. So even in the few years where I was being a peer educator on campus at the University of Illinois, I saw a difference between when I started. I used to ask this question like, hey, what's victim blaming? And then no one would raise their hand and they wouldn't really know what to say. By the end, when I was leaving as a senior, many people raised their hands. They knew exactly what victim blaming was. So it was like, even in that short time, I noticed that people were changing their perspective. Louie, I know that you had some experience at the beginning, though, when we were you couldn't get anyone to kind of talk about sexual violence.
Yeah, I agree with, plus I'm a guy in this field, which is a rarity, right? But I was probably 9 years ago. So I agree with everything Alison said, right? It's so changed in the social media. And you and I, by the way, Emilie, have had these conversations about, using, so you're one person as an educator. And we used to sit there and go, well, okay, we got in front of that group of 20 people and it was a pretty good day. And today that is just, the exponential factor of social media, of television broadcasts, of podcasts, of all the things that we're doing differently. But I don't think those platforms would have even been made available to us had Me Too not come. Who knew that the crazy Harvey Weinsteins and Bill Cosby's and stuff of the time would be such a springboard into bringing, the conversation to the forefront. And to your point, Emilie, when I got here 9 years ago, because I'm the spokesperson for the agency, right? So I can remember doing a television story, and I was pretty green, and I'm throwing around the word rape, and so they weren't ready. Like, they were in shock. They being the TV people, the story, I can remember the story. So the story ran, and like my voice, every time I'd say rape, there was just like this silence where they had like erased the word rape. And so when I called, I'm like, I think something's wrong with the broadcast. And they said, listen, the producer said, that's way too salacious for 5:30 dinner time talk, And I was like, but I'm being honest here. Like I'm just talking about the facts of the work that we do and what's happening. And so I learned to nuance my language and use the term sexual assault and, but at the same time, then all those other things started happening in the media. So these people that I was desperate to try to get to allow me to get my message out, and then they were muting me, changed quickly. And then all of a sudden they're like, do you have a comment? I'm like, yeah, man, I got lots of comments. And then this platform became available to us. And so, and then, if we went in and when we went in, I think for those of us that are advocates, we just were straightforward and factual and talked about the work that we do and the healing that we provide. And it just started getting momentum, and it made the dialogue more commonplace. And then you start adding activities like Start by Believing, where people will come together, publicly come together and have these conversations. And then you add Sexual Assault Awareness Month, the very reason why we're here, right? And we have a whole month now where we have this platform to be creative in our field and come up with new ideas to try to draw attention, to sexual violence and to the conversation. I think the other thing that changed too was the conversation used to be always between, the reporter and the victim. And now, and everybody else was like, doesn't affect me. I wasn't a victim. And today now we have so many ambassadors and advocates and people that, maybe have not directly been impacted, but they want to be part of our cause. They see the benefits of a loved one that was hurt. And so now they want to be part of working to eradicate sexual violence and keep the conversation out there on the table. I think that's what I see. So where are we? Are we there? We're partially there. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. If I had a nickel for every time somebody said, "Wow, I didn't even know your organization existed," it makes me nuts because I feel like everybody knows, but really, fractional amount know, and we got to just keep pedal to the metal and just keep doing what we're doing.
For sure. Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that story, Louie. Every time you share it, I'm like shocked that that's where it was. And now where we're at now, where we're just having a whole program about our services and who would have thought that it would have changed that quickly. And going back to what you first started saying in the beginning, Alison, you said, at the beginning, it was more risk reduction focused instead of prevention. So how has that kind of shifted as far as violence prevention in general from this, like, what exactly is risk reduction when we talk about it? And then how we kind of shifted away, or do we need to continue shifting away? Just your thoughts about that.
So I have not been engaged in prevention work in a long time. So I want to put up a disclaimer about that before I say anything. But to me, when I use the word risk reduction or awareness education, really what that meant to me was just shining a light on sexual assault. This is what it is. This is how frequently it occurs. These are the myths and the facts around it. So it was never, from my perspective, this is how you can not be sexually assaulted, which we know prevention education used to be targeted at females and how they could avoid being a victim of rape. That was never the way that I did it. I mean, even 20 years ago, it was always more of creating an understanding of the realities of sexual assault. So talking about the fact that false reports are rare, talking about most survivors know the person who has sexually assaulted them, those kinds of pieces of information. And I know that you can speak a lot more eloquently about the prevention programs that are available now and what people are doing, because I'm so far removed from that. But that's kind of how we handled it 20 years ago.
That's amazing that already 20 years ago that you were already coming from that lens. I could tell you now that a lot of what we do in prevention work through, and I work with, UCF researchers and things like that, and people like that, I should say. We come from an active bystander approach, right? So, risk reduction could be really victim blaming, where we're like, oh, well, do this and that, and you won't be. And it's like, that's not really how sexual violence works, right? It's about power and control and all those different things, and putting it on just for women, assuming that men and non-binary folk and all that different stuff. So coming at it from like an active bystander approach is kind of where we go, where we see if something seems wrong or off, trust your instincts, and these are different ways you can jump in and help prevent it. And then of course your resources for survivors. So I wanted to kind of to just the few more minutes that we have together, I wanted to ask, we talked a little bit how, work still needs to kind of be done, but I wanted to ask, like, what are you most proud of, and why do you continue the work that you do?
That's a big question. Honestly, what I'm most proud of today. One of the things I've thought a lot about over the last year and a half is I'm so far removed from direct service work these days. I mean, I've been working with a national organization now for over 10 years. I haven't picked up a crisis line call in almost 11 years. I haven't provided hospital advocacy in almost 11 years. And there's a big piece of me that hates that aspect of being so disconnected. But, I have 2 kids at home, and for many years my husband traveled, and it wasn't feasible for me to be on call, whether it's a staff member or a volunteer, in the middle of the night. So I had to kind of let that piece go. And I kind of found myself in this place of, why am I doing what I'm doing? I'm not doing this direct work. Am I doing anything that makes an impact? And then I started the Survivor Voices Project. And it brought every aspect of the last 20 years of my career back full circle. And it made me realize that I might not be creating change or making an impact on a local level, on a direct service level, but now I get to make it on a national level. And I get to be engaged in the Survivor Project, which has been so profound. I mean, there's really no words to say what it has been like working with the survivors that I've connected with, providing them space to share their stories. Has been amazing. So that is something I am profoundly proud of and happy to be a part of. But the other aspect is just start by believing, being able to manage and oversee this campaign that I know in my heart is making tremendous change for survivors in communities across the country. It's an amazing thing to be a part of. So those 2 things keep me going.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alison, for being so, vulnerable with that and sharing exactly. I totally hear you as a prevention educator. Sometimes I do have those days too, where I'm like, man, is anything I'm doing, making that change? And I'm just kind of reminding everyone out there that change is like this ripple effect, right? You work with maybe one survivor, having that platform, and then that communal healing really kind of just snowballs from there. So thank you so much, Alison, for all that.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I have 2 girls. They're almost 11 and 13. And they tell everybody what I do. They're proud of what I do, which reinforces that I should be proud of the work that I do and the stuff that I'm engaged in. And that feels really good. And my 13-year-old, we're in a community that does provide comprehensive sex education. And they had the local rape crisis center. They actually provide mentoring. So the rape crisis center mentors high school students, who then in turn go into high school classes and middle school classes, and they do sexual assault and sexual harassment training. So they come in, there's always an adult that's in the classroom, but my daughter was so excited to have them come in and just kept raising her hand and saying, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I'm so grateful that we are in a community that provides that in the middle school level. She's in 7th grade and she had this last semester. It's amazing. They do
that
talk
is
about
not the norm. Just so
I know.
The cow. That's amazing.
But she was so excited to tell her teacher all these things that she knew because of the conversations that we have. So kind of back to my initial comment of why am I doing what I'm doing? And then these kind of moments just reinforce all the little ways that we can make a difference.
I love that so much. And I'm going to put Louie on the spot and ask how, what are you proud of, Louie? And why do you continue to do what you do at the VSC?
Well, I've done a lot of different things in my career. And I've been blessed to be able to try my hand at a lot of different things. And one of which, and it wasn't even my idea, was the creation of the Victim Service Center. And I had the good fortune of working for a former county commissioner, the first ever Hispanic elected to local office here in Central Florida. And she came in and I was her assistant, when I came out of grad school, and she came in and said, we need to have a program to help victims, and I was like, okay, great. Here we go, but my job was to make those things come to fruition. So yeah, I mean, in hindsight, I was not an early adopter. I did ultimately write my job description. I did ultimately help get this thing birthed. And now you fast forward 23 years later, and I had a whole bunch of different stops along the way. I came back here about 9 years ago to be the executive director, but it is the most rewarding thing I've ever done in my life as far as the day-to-day work. The people that come into this field inspire me on a daily basis. They're just who wakes up and chooses to do that work. I mean, they see the worst thing you can imagine their clients have experienced, and they work with those clients back to back to back every day. That gives me all I need to be able to get up in the morning, come here and do what I do, which is to try to make sure that we got resources and that the grants are flowing, and that nobody here has to worry about their job or where the money's coming from or any of that. Like, if I can take that burden off their back, then all they have to focus on is trying to help heal people. And so I mean, that is the most proud thing for me, for sure. And to find a space where like I know I belong. I worked in a lot of other areas, made a lot more money, but it wasn't rewarding. This work is rewarding personally, intrinsically, and every person that I've met that comes into this work is of like mind, and that it's inspiring, and it's so we need to just get the message out to even more people, inspire the next generation and the future leaders and anybody that will listen to our message.
Definitely. And I think that's a great segue into kind of this final few questions here, as far as how can people, get involved in general, but also specifically with Sexual Assault Awareness Month. What are some events that you want to highlight, that you want to uplift, and ways that people can get more involved as community members in this work?
Well, we know Allison's got Start by Believing Day, first Wednesday. I can tell you here in Central Florida, we do a bunch of stuff. We've got a lot going on coming up here on the horizon. So we have a project. We're going to be dedicating a new garden in the very back of our main office, and we took this old decrepit parking lot area in the back, and one of our therapists or crisis counselors had this idea for a support group of creating a garden and having the clients do the work, and then use the analogy of the growth of the plants and the garden and the beauty to symbolize their growth and evolution, right? And it has been so powerful. And the garden looks gorgeous, by the way. It's so pretty. And we had one of our local hospitals that wanted to partner with us and underwrite the cost of that. So we're going to be actually dedicating that garden on April 12th. And of course, it's one of our activities during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We just had our big gala, which we always do on the first Friday in April. And, we get 300 of our friends and supporters in a room and have a big party. And, but also take the opportunity to drive home the importance of the work we do and make it known to the community. And then we have Victims' Rights Week, which is, it's going to be a little later this month. It's usually smack dab in the middle of the month as well. That's on the horizon. Then we'll have a big breakfast. We don't organize it all. We work with our community partners. It's a very collaborative recognition of our peers that do God's work here in our community to help victims. And then we always end the month with a huge push for Denim Day. So just like Start Believing Day is the first Wednesday of April, the last Wednesday in April is Denim Day USA always. And we have for any of your listeners that might be hearing this, if you're interested in learning more about it, go onto our website. We have a whole page dedicated to it. But essentially, everybody in this community is going to be wearing their denim on Wednesday. We will have proclamations from all the counties and cities, and they will let all their employees wear denim. But the caveat is they have to have a conversation about sexual assault awareness and prevention. And then they take a group picture and they post it to our hashtag Denim Day. And then, it will explode. It's a social media campaign. We get participants at all over the Southeast, all over the state of Florida. I mean, it's really grown exponentially in the years that we've been championing Denim Day here in our community. So we're probably 7-8 years into doing that. And, it just, like I said, keep the pedal to the metal. We should do more in the other odd out months, but we will be very tired by the end of April. I can tell you that.
We always are very, very tired by the end of April. But it is a very great time. And there's also like the 30 Days of Sam challenge on social media that we'll be participating in as well. So check out.
Hey, we won 2 of those last year, by the way. That's a national campaign. And we landed 2 days the last 30 days.
It was awesome.
Sam.
Yeah, it's very cool. Very fun way to engage and stuff like that. Alison, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add as far as SAM events that we may not have covered that you wanted to uplift. I think we kind of covered a lot of them though.
I don't know if NSVRC still does it, but isn't Tuesday, April 5th, the National SAM Day of Action?
It might be. I think
it used to be at.
Yeah.
And I don't know. We're going to have to get Kyle on that. He's our social media guru. So probably.
Yeah, I think that is one of their challenges for 30 Days of Sam, where they're like, for this day, do like highlight an action. So yeah, I think that they kind of cross promote that. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up too.
Back in the day, we used to take, when I was with the Rape Crisis Center in Kansas City, Missouri, we used to take posters to bars and restaurants all across the Kansas City metro area on that day and ask permission to hang them in bathroom stalls. And every single person always said yes. And then, months later, somebody would go to one of them and take a picture and be like, look, it's still there.
Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah, that's really important to engage as far as like who to reach out to or be an active bystander in that regard too.
Mm-hmm.
There are just so many great ideas that are out there. And so, just using this vehicle of even your podcast for your listeners, don't wait for somebody else. I think Alison mentioned it. I love the idea of the peer mentorship program she was talking about with high school kids going in. And then, who are kids going to listen to? They're going to listen to their peers, so it's brilliant. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist. It takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort. And, if this speaks to you, if this issue speaks to you, go do something or reach out to us or your local rape crisis center. And, I guarantee you are going to get a listening ear that's going to want to partner with you and help spread the news and the word about the good work that we're doing.
Absolutely. And it just takes one person too, just takes that one, and then people will flock and definitely see that change. I think that's a great place to sign off. But before I do, is there anything else that you, Alison, or you, Louie, want to add or say?
I just have one quick thing. If you haven't already, you can take the Start by Believing pledge. I don't know if you can put that link to that on the show notes, but anybody can take the Start by Believing pledge. It's on the website. It's just a commitment to start by believing if someone discloses to you.
Thank you so much, Alison. And thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services and other services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much, Alison and Louie, for joining me today.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.